I don't like to say we're data-driven because I don't think in education you can be, because it's a people industry. It's teachers, it's students, it's families, it's data-informed.
We came into an educational mindset that was kind of data poor, and any data that we could get was kind of like really highly valued and espoused by everyone. And we're no longer starving for data. We're drowning in data in many cases.
You're listening to Data Talks, the podcast from Data in Schools, in association with Atlanta International School and the Mona Lisa Effect, and sponsored by Veracross and IntelliSchool.
I'm Paul Swanson, Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School and part of the Data in Schools team.
And I'm Matthew Savage, Educator, Leader, Consultant and Coach.
We are pleased to welcome Damian Bebell and Hywel Benbow today. A research professor at Boston College Lynch School of Education and Human Development, Damian is the researcher in residence for the Apple Distinguished School program. He has also developed a new generation of research and reflection tools to support schools and systems in using data to better inform their technology investments and evolve teaching and learning practices.
And Howell is the Senior Vice President of Global Data, AI and Analytics at GEMS Education. He leads the group's data and analytics strategy to deliver impactful data-informed solutions across education and corporate functions. Howell has also been recognised twice in the Data IQ 100 list of the most influential people in data and was shortlisted for Global Data Leader of the Year.
So welcome to our podcast, the place where data talks and we listen. Welcome, Howell, and welcome, Damian. So excited to have you here on the Data Talks podcast. Let's just kick it off with our first question. How do you think schools can avoid being overwhelmed by too much data and focus on what really matters?
I'll jump in with a bit. I think there's an appetite in schools to collect as much as possible, and when you start collecting as much as possible, you sort of miss what you should be collecting, and I think the quality goes down. So I think there's always that appetite to go, oh, okay, we should collect this, collect that, and when that happens, you miss some of the key bits. So I think it's always take that step back and look at what you're actually trying to achieve. And it's slightly different in different schools, depending on what the demographics are, what the school's like, what they're working for. But focus on those bits that align with your direction of travel, your core strategy from an education institution, and then start collecting the data points that really go for that. There's the normal stuff you'll collect anyway around demographics and things, but it's around focusing on some of those elements that really hit home for seeing the progress and the attainment and the growth of your students, and then focusing on those bits more than trying to collect everything.
Does it depend in any way on context, like the capacity of a school team to be able to process and manage and use it, the data literacy of the team, the competency in doing so? Do these things have an impact on what is too much and too little, or do you think it's better to just keep it tighter regardless?
I think you start with tight because that's the core stuff that you need to do, and then you can add additional bits to it. I think if you're a standalone school that doesn't have a huge amount of personnel who's working on it, then being bombarded with a huge amount of different data fields and data sets is a challenge. If you're part of a group or a school that has a few more people around it, you can actually do a little bit more with the stuff. There's no point in having lots of data that's sitting there adding no value, no one's using. And I think that's one of the things. So in my current role, we have the ability to have a data team and lots of functions. So we're able to collect a lot more information. We're able to process it for all schools in one go, and therefore you can play around with it a little bit more. But if you are a school on its own that's got maybe one person or a teacher that's doing that data role as well, it's a bit of a challenge if you've got multiple data sets across different things, because you have to collect them, you have to process them, you have to clean them, you have to try and match them. And probably that you'll spend all of your time doing that, not actually delivering any insights. But if you narrow it down and go, okay, here's the 3 or 4 things I really need to know about, you can focus on those a little bit more and leave the sort of the fluffy stuff outside.
Thanks, Howell.
Damien, you've worked with a lot of schools on data analysis and all different kinds of schools. What would you say to add to that?
I mean, thanks, Paul, and really delighted to have the opportunity to kind of reflect and talk about this together. I think Hal really nailed it, and with the quote like, "What are you trying to achieve?" So for a really long time, it seemed like we were data poor for many of us, and most of us, even if we're in our first 5 years in administration or teaching, we came into an educational mindset that was kind of data poor, and any data that we could get was kind of like really highly valued and espoused by everyone, and a lot of thought went into that data because it was so challenging to get, like an assessment program, or if we were going to survey our staff 20 years ago, so much thought went into that survey because it was such an effort. And we've really, in a generation of students, in a generation of teacher education and teacher leadership programs, we've moved to a like we're no longer starving for data. We're drowning in data in many cases. And so we've moved to this mindset where it's like, well, how do we know what do we have the capacity for, to Matthew's point? What do we have the literacy to deal with? But I think it still comes down to that fundamental point and the fundamental question of what you're trying to achieve. And the mechanism that I've used with many of the schools that I've worked with or had the privilege of just interacting with has been, like, well, let's start with the mission. Let's start with what you've already done in your community to define success. What are your core values? What are your competencies? And rather than just like jumping off into the data, which so many consultants and so many data people just start with the data, I think Howell's point is starting with the question, starting with what you're trying to achieve. And if you're not sure, well, go back to your mission, go back to your governing documents, talk to your constituents and your stakeholders, and let that guide then, well, what is the appropriate data to address that? And chances are there's going to be something out there, and then you build your capacity and your literacy. And to Matthew's point, it's also really easy to think about. One of my favorite quotes from Seymour Papert was, it's easy to imagine the limitations of our technology or computers today and project on to them tomorrow. And so thinking about our schools and our literacy teams and the data literacy of our teams right now and the capacity is going to be understandably much more limited than what it will look like in 3 to 5 years. But the data we're collecting now can be used in the future. So, think forward, but be grounded in what your mission and what that core question is.
I often wonder, though, that the really data-hungry, data-philic leader who just can't get enough of it, right? There isn't such a thing as too much data. And yet I often think of, like, I don't know, a middle school or a secondary school music teacher who might see 200 kids in 1 week, and they are expected to use the data as much as somebody who has the privilege of only a small class or a small number of classes. I wonder, coming back to something you said, Howell, about what people are using as well. But think about librarians. Some of the best librarians keep a really close track on what books are being taken out so that they can ensure they have enough stock of the books that are being taken out by the library's users. I wonder, when we're building and maintaining data systems, is there a sort of a library mindset that could guide us there? If we knew what data our users were accessing and it was exactly the stuff that we wanted them to access, well, then we've got like that alignment. But what if there's not that alignment in terms of what they're using and what we wanted them to?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I'm not an educator, and I've worked in sort of different industries, but in education for a while. And part of it's clear for me is the context. I will sit with people in different curriculums in different schools and talk about the data they collect, the data that we collect, the data, how we can collect that better, and then try and bring that together. So from an American curriculum school to an IB school to a national curriculum school to an Indian curriculum school, they're all very different and they'll look at things in very different ways. And it's all fine because the context is different in every school. A school that is a ultra premium is going to look at things differently than a school that's on the lower cost side. And the makeup of the students are different. If you have students that are very much second language and struggling with that, you're probably going to be looking at some of that data around literacy levels and reading levels a lot more than you are at a school that has really high ability students, because that's already covered. I don't really need to keep checking that because that's already part of it. So I think it's working out what's the key data sets for each stakeholder in that sense. But one thing I tend to use it at work quite a bit is I don't like to say we're data driven, because I don't think in education you can be, because it's a people industry. It's teachers, it's students, it's families. It's data informed, and it's like, okay, so you need to have the data, but you also need the context around it to understand it. And part of that from my team's bit is to understand the context, so we don't start pushing data on people that they don't need, that is no use for them. Because as soon as we start doing that, it takes them away from the stuff that is actually useful. So it is that sort of, I like the librarian way approach of it, to go, what is useful to that context and that stakeholder at that time, and then channel that through to them.
One of the themes in both of your statements, I'm hearing it in this context of sort of top-down versus bottom-up data approach. So the top-down thinking, what is our school mission? Or if you're in a schools group, what are the data that are of value within the schools group? And then that bottom-up, what's really relevant to people on the ground as they're making decisions? And I imagine sometimes those two things are in alignment, but sometimes they might be quite divergent as well. And I'm curious as to how you navigate that tension.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right in that there's often incongruence between the top-down data sources and what people on the ground, like teachers, would find valuable. And to Matthew's point of like, how does a music teacher with 200 students in one term use data in their own way? And in those cases, I think the top-down approaches can often feel really mismatched. And there are cases where it is really nicely aligned, where academic and cognitive goals are usually central. And we've developed a lot of data and supports to measure and support students and teachers in meeting those goals over the last 100 years. But as schools think more broadly about success, and particularly like the bottom up, what teachers are talking to in parent-teacher conferences, how they're thinking about the whole child and reflecting that, which is usually reflected in the mission if you begin there, are some democratizing technologies that I think are pretty exciting, and that like apps and tools that teachers can use, like the music teacher who is using something where kids can use an iPad or a phone or even a very simple technology device to see if they're on pitch, or to record themselves and play it back at various points in time where a teacher can give feedback. That inherently are new forms of data that are very bottom up, that are really exciting and can really change pedagogy and teaching and learning opportunities, where, these summative top-down systems that we've kind of inherited have their purpose and role. But what's happening now is I think they're meeting in the middle, and teachers have access to like the world at their fingertips, but are also in these systems that are using very traditional top-down academic measures of success and data systems, and are expected to be conversant and make them meet. And I think there's a lot of tension there in the classroom and even in leadership and in governance.
I love that you're talking about power there as well, because what's come up in a lot of our other conversations is the extent to which users often fear data. And they fear data because, I don't know, they remember back to when they were a kid at school and they weren't very good at maths, whatever that means. Or they fear data because it's been this stick with which they have been beaten or might be beaten. And I wonder whether one of the balances you guys are alluding to here is that balance between data for accountability and data for improvement. And if you think about top and bottom, although the hierarchy is not necessarily what we would like to think of it as, but if you think of this student, they want data to be used, if it's going to be used, in such a way that helps them to get better. There's many a school leader who wants to use data to hold their team to account. And I wonder, how do we get that balance in our data policy and our data practice, that balance between data actually making minds and lives better and data being able to hold to account in a sort of a power hierarchy of some sort?
I'll hand it over to Howell, but I just think culture, and leadership are a big part of that, and setting policy and agenda and modeling that is an important component that we've seen where schools have done that successfully versus the schools that have just really dug in and struggled. Howell, I know you're inside of it.
I don't think it's an easy balance because there are different stakeholders at different levels. And if you're looking at the principal of the school, maybe it's the board that they're accountable to, and the board is going, you need to show you're getting wonderful results at the end of grade 12. And that's what they see. And then below that, you go, well, that's one grade. But to get those wonderful results, there is a lot going on across different elements. So the teacher in the classroom is sort of accountable to that child. And they're looking at how do I make sure that the growth or the progress of that child is exceeding what they should do or matching what they should do. And I think when you're looking at some of the international schools that have quite a few thousand children in them, the top level look down is not looking at the growth of individual children, but over the course of a number of years, if those children are making the relevant growth they should and making the progress they should, you will start to chip away at the results at the top end. So it's sort of one follows the other, really. And I think it's sort of trying to get that understood. And again, as Damian said, it's a culture piece to go, you can't just flip a switch and get wonderful results. There's a lot of work that goes into that. And I think in the international setting, it's a little bit tricky because students are not with schools for year after year after year. Some they're coming and going, and it's quite a transient population. So I think it's the different stakeholders look at it in different lenses. But I think if you have that culture of we need to improve as a school, because if we improve as a school, our students improve, that's the way of doing it. And go, actually, our students should be getting X results in their IB, but actually we've managed to exceed that, which is great. And I think, Matthew, the context that I work in the Middle East here, where it is very, very interesting because sometimes it's very much on attainment and sometimes it's more on the progress element. And I think it's a hard balance because you don't get the attainment without the progress. Because if it just doesn't work that way. So I think it's understanding the wider context of a school, understanding the international context that students will come and go and it's transient. And you may not have that longitudinal, well, they've been with us for 10 years and this is our impact. It might be they turned up 18 months ago and we've got to do the best we can for this child who doesn't speak English, but we're going to teach them in English. And they're two very different things because that child is, probably not going to get really, really high results. But can we get them the results that they deserve for what they've got in here? And those are challenges. But yeah, I think Damian's right. It's a cultural aspect. I think it's that golden thread. If everyone understands where they're coming from and where they're going to, it's much easier. But if that's not there, then it's a challenge.
Imagine a system that understands how independent schools work, where the soccer coach is also the algebra teacher, where parents are alumni, where everyone plays multiple roles. Most school software forces you to juggle separate systems for students, parents, alumni, donors, fragmenting the people you serve into disconnected data points. It's exhausting, and it misses what matters most. Veracross is different. One person, one record. Comprehensive software that connects every department with real-time data, all centered on the whole person. No silos, just seamless collaboration across your entire school. Veracross.com. Trusted by 3,200 schools worldwide. Imagine what you could achieve with data that works for good.
We're talking about data culture here, and earlier you mentioned how we used to live in a culture or a data poor culture. Now we have a sort of an abundance, drowning in data, right? We may be drowning in raw data, but there are other elements where there's still sort of bottlenecks, and the phrase necessary but not sufficient sort of comes to mind, right? We have the data, but what are some of the other things in your experience that schools really need in order to get everything lined up and get all the cylinders firing on this one so that you really see that data magic happening? What are the necessary ingredients?
I mean, I think one of the real, like we talk about magic and there are examples of like really amazing things. And this whole podcast was kind of a testament to those opportunities. But I think some of it is also really simple. and almost so simple it's like the forest through the trees. And sometimes I feel like kind of Forrest Gump in these conversations. And one of the first things we encounter, and this has been the case for over a decade, supporting schools with research and data, has been simply de-siloing and cleaning existing data. And what that means in practical terms to your listeners is having an individual on the team who is responsible for making sure that everyone has the same name in every data set and a same unique identifier. And it doesn't seem, I mean, we're all kind of snickering. You can't see it on the audio here. But the truth is so many great initiatives end up just kind of faltering because of very simple, like no one's had to do this before. This is a new skill for a school level leader or for a district level leader or for an international school organization. How do we ensure that that student who shows up at Howell School with limited English and maybe from another school in their system or maybe not, can get the right information in the right form in the right places so it can be, we can make some magic. But too often than not, I'm in the system with 4 different names, 2 different IDs, and 3 different dates of birth. And that's been okay up until now, but it restricts what we can do. So I know that there's so many of your speakers and conversations are about the next generation, but simply cleaning what we have and de-siloing it provides massive opportunities and infrastructure to create some magic and learn a few tricks and use that. So as much as we want to focus on like the last 15%, I'm spend most of my time and energy on the bottom 15%, just like where are these files? Why are they look so corrupted? Why is date, like the date of birth, constantly different in every file? Like, can we figure that out? And once we do that, we can start to have really cool conversations. But leaders need to recognize that's an important and potentially time-consuming step that has to happen.
What's some of the experience behind the laughter on your side, Howell?
Yeah, basically data foundations. If you don't have them, you're going to struggle, whatever it is. The data strategy that we run has assets, products, and insights. And the assets are the foundations of it all. That's making sure that your data is clean, is tidy, and you can match it up. So making sure that there's student IDs in there. You pick a source of the truth. That doesn't matter if it's education data. That's from our commercial stuff, our HR stuff. It's the same. So without decent assets, you're going to struggle. And how big those assets are depend on your school or your organization. Ours are pretty big. There's nearly 150,000 students in the schools and about 10,000 teachers. So there's a lot of information that's flowing in that. But it's around those data standards you put in place and communicate those across the board to say, look, this is how we collect data. These are the key things we do. If we're talking about SEND or we're talking about something else, these are the categorizations we use, and you put master lists in place and you're trying to get everyone to talk the same language. Because if you start having different grade groups collecting stuff in different ways, it's very tricky to manage. If you start having different people doing, different mark books in different ways, it's very tricky to see which things are performing well or not. So those basic data standards, common data standards, whatever you want to call them, are key. And then it's making sure that those are adhered to, because from then you can start to build data products, whatever that might be. It might be a model, it might be an Excel, it might be a report, whatever you not do. But if you don't have that foundation, you're going to struggle to do stuff. It'll take a lot more time. Then you can start looking at the insights bit. And that's the bit that really adds the value, but probably is the bit that takes 10% of the time at the moment, because 60 or 70% of the time is done on fixing the data at the foundational part. And then it's, okay, I can build something on that. Oh, I don't really have enough time to do the insights because all the kids have moved on now and gone. But if you get those bits right in the beginning, your foundations actually take a lot less time. Therefore, you can spend far more time and flip that switch to say, well, I'm going to look at the data now and analyze the data and come up with insights. And I think that's the challenge in schools that I've worked with across the board over the years, that there's so much time is spent on getting the data to a standard that's good enough to use, that not enough time is then spent on doing the insights work, which is actually where the value is.
I think that's wonderful, and it's kind of refreshing, because that's also not the hard stuff. It's hard stuff clearly because we're not managing it, but it's not actually the stuff that takes a high degree of technical proficiency, is it, to get the data clean in the first place?
It's process.
For how, like, within the schools that you support, or for Paul or Matthew, who's playing that role? This is 60% of the time and energy that we're putting forward, is just doing, focusing on assets. And as Matthew suggested, this isn't a high technical necessarily skill. Like, this isn't there's no technology obstacle here, but it remains an obstacle in so many schools. I would be very curious, just personally, and like, who's playing that role, and how are schools kind of stepping up to that across the international schools that you see?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. From my experience, it's putting in place that strategy and those standards, and this is the way we're going to do it. And going back every time that those aren't at the same quality, and you go, no, that's not how we do it. This is how we do it. This is how we do it. I think as you mature, then you start to pull more and more data sets in. It's a bit easier. We're in a situation where we're very automated in what we do, so a lot of that stuff is done and clean for us because we've built the processes to do it. So we've cut that foundational time down massively over the last few years to a place where we can spend longer on the products and the insights bit. But it's finding those people in the schools who are responsible for different bits. If it's a data manager at school, it's a math teacher, it's someone who's doing it, and communicate as much to them. Send out the details that this is how we collect X, Y, and Z, and these are the structures that we need. But also, if it is in systems, it's setting the systems up so that consistent as well. You can have the most wonderful piece of technology, but if you have the worst process, you're going to get rubbish data. You can have the oldest piece of technology in the world, but if you set it up right, you'll get good data out at the end. It might be a bit clunky, but you'll get good data at the end. And I think it's working through those things. And what I found in education is people will buy technology and go, all our problems are sorted. We've got some great tech. And then the tech is not set up very well. And then people go, well, it doesn't really work. And we haven't integrated it over there. And I've just got lots of silos and I'm spending money on licenses. Where you could sort of scale back and go, you'd be in a better place if you didn't buy as much, just bought a couple of things, set them up in the right way, and then build on those foundations that you've got. So it takes a bit. I think there needs to be, for a group, there needs to be someone that is owning the data part, is owning the strategy with it and owning the standards. And then there needs to be that accountability that comes back to it to go, no, that's not how we do it. This is how we do it. And that's a bit of a repetitive thing. The one way that I talk about it, I don't like to talk about a data culture, because we don't talk about a marketing culture and we don't talk about a finance culture. They're just ingrained already. I try and talk about, I want data to be part of our culture. It's just a normal thing within it. And I think there's trying to get that flip from people going, oh, we have a data culture. We use data all the time. It's like, no, I want this data to be part of our normal culture. I want you to do all the other bits, but just data's part of that as an everyday thing. So those are the China bits, but it's a journey to get to that place. And are we there yet? Am I there yet? Probably close, I think. Some places, yeah, brilliant. Other places, not so much. But that's just part of the journey.
And then there are all the schools who are just single schools. They don't have the benefit of the capacity of those group structures and staffing, etc. And oftentimes I found in schools it comes down to the expectations of essentially what is data entry. I've mentored, I've coached lots of senior leaders on the big bucks who are spending their time doing the data entry because it's the only way I can make sure it's accurate, right? Which doesn't make any sense at all. But then I've seen it delegated to somebody without the correct expectations. And then the response that I often see from the administrative teams in those schools is, well, it's almost accurate, or I reckon it's mostly correct. And where I've come back on that is the expectation has to be of complete accuracy, because there's either complete accuracy or there's inaccuracy. But I think that isn't immediately obvious to everyone, perhaps. So I wonder whether sometimes in the smaller schools, Howell, isn't it to do with the expectations you have of the person whose responsibility it is to get those assets in cleanly?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what matters. If you collect data that matters, you can collect it better. And I think sometimes it's collecting too much, and that's the problem. People just don't have the time to check it and make all the things are going in. But yeah, it's around someone setting those standards. If that's the principal in the school, it's the head of curriculum or assessment, whoever it might be in a school, needs to set those standards and expectations. and say, right, these are the roles and responsibilities and accountability to making sure our data is good enough. Data's never perfect, but it needs to be good enough. And good enough depends, it can change depending on what your context is. If it's looking at the progress of a child in a maths test, it needs to be pretty accurate. If it's looking at all the information on admittance and things like that and the journeys that come in, it probably doesn't need to be perfect because you're looking for an idea of how things work. So it's making sure that everyone knows that my role is assessment and progress, therefore the data needs to be really accurate, or my role is looking at something else from an enrollment point of view, and it doesn't need to be as accurate, but it needs to be good enough. But yeah, I think it's, again, we go back to that first comment we talked about. It's what actually matters. What are the core data sets that we need to get right, and setting the standards and expectations on those.
I guess one of the mental models I find helpful in thinking about this is in terms of vicious cycles and virtuous cycles. So the vicious cycle version would be someone looks at a visualization or a chart or something, is like, those numbers don't look right. And so they stop looking at those charts and they keep their own spreadsheet somewhere that has the real numbers. And then the system of record gets so gradually more and more out of date and inaccurate, and people spend less and less attention to it because everyone knows it's inaccurate. And then the flip side of that is you have visualizations or data protocols where you're using the data and you're like, oh, that doesn't look quite right. Let me fix it so that this is useful. And then they go in and fix it at this source, and the data visualization becomes more useful, and so more people will see it, and then more people will fix it at the source, and you get that sort of convergence on a single data truth, I guess you could say, of what the numbers actually are or should be. I'm curious, first of all, do you see it in similar terms, or do you see it a little differently from that? And where might this sort of thing come up in your experience?
Yeah, I think you've definitely got to get trust in the data. There's different ways of doing measures as well. People will look at stuff in a slightly different way. They'll include different cohorts in different things. And so there's an understanding as well of what you're visualizing. What's the calculation behind it? What are you including or not including in that? So I think there's some clarity that comes around what is the measure. What are you showing? I will say to my teams, it's, we QA and we go back and we test before we release things, because we're looking at quite a lot of people at different bits, and sometimes it's different in certain schools. So we'll go and go, this doesn't look quite right, and go back and have a conversation with that. And I think there's getting over that bit. So sometimes people do worry about the data and go, oh, if people see this, they'll find something and you just stick to beat me with and things. So I'll try and maybe manipulate it slightly. And that happens across every industry. I think it's, people try and make the numbers look as good. But I think if you're quite clear and say, this is the business rule around this metric, this is how we calculate it, this is the source system we're pulling that data from. As long as everyone is okay, that's the right place to get the data from, that's the right metric to be looking at, the trust grows. And I think where you can look, we said before that, everyone's laptop is their own data warehouse. There's Excel spreadsheets galore in it, and they've done their own calculations and manipulations of the data, and they've come up with 68%. And they go, well, your thing says 62. And then you sort of go back through that and go, yeah, but you've also not included this. You've taken that out of context and there, and you go, that's why the difference. So I think, finding those business rules and agreements of what we're all looking at, and are we looking at the same thing in the same way, is clear. That starts to develop the trust. But there's always elements where you'll have a slightly different number to somebody else, and then you'll go back through it and go, okay, because your cohort is 103 kids and mine is 106. So who are the three and where have they vanished to? And that's, you can get back to those. But once you have those conversations, it's about being open on both sides. You can start to then pinpoint that and go, okay, that's our difference, but why do we have that difference in the first place? And then you can understand, again, context.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit to what makes good analytics or good visualization, because pretty much every school I talk to now is determined the one thing they need to do is to buy the right analytics package or buy the right visualization platform. And once they've got that, these scary numbers will be turned into super friendly pictures and graphs, and everyone in the school will understand it. So there's a real kind of expectation that tech will offer this panacea. And I wonder, how can we get those analytics and those visualizations right in that context of high expectations?
Well, I'm smiling because, anytime someone offers a panacea with technology for schools, we kind of know what's coming next. We know the challenges of that. But I think this is, again, an opportunity to think about what schools are ultimately trying to accomplish with their data and what they're trying to do. And to the point about having, systems in place, having people trained within those systems and understand it. But we talk about trust, we talk about culture. It ultimately, I think to Howell's point, it's not data culture, but it is a school culture. And if we are in an environment where we feel things are, like there are petty measures of our success and now we are visualizing them, I don't think there's any representation that's going to make that palatable or feel congruent to an educator or to a teacher if it's the wrong thing. The technology itself, I think what's important is that it has to be simple and adaptive to different needs and meet people where they're at. And I think too often we try to make really complex solutions as data scientists and data researchers that maybe have too many features and too many options for many of the end users. And again, like just giving people a basic reflection tool that works, and even if it's used at like a substitution or an augmentation level, I think is better than trying to blow out a system that does everything for everyone at once. So for me, I'm thinking about the stories of schools and classrooms that have made the most effective actual use in changing a practice or a policy with data. And it hasn't been the fact that they could visualize it in a scatter plot, whereas before it was just a bar chart. It was the fact that they had the right data and the right people at the table. And that's so much of it. And then the tools themselves can come and go. And I know we like to like buy the product and get what's shiny. And literally we use like a plugin called Shiny in R for many of our dashboard features. So I totally get it. But I think keeping things simple, I'm a fan of bar charts and scatter plots because it's hard to hide and hide a student or hide a case in those settings. But generally, it's the people and the underlying story that changes practice and policy in a school. It's the dashboards that allow people to get to that point. So let's not make obstacles with the tools is my biggest suggestion.
What about you, Howell? How do you avoid the shiny and get the visualization and the dashboard and the analytics to work?
You can do a lot with an Excel or a Google Sheets. You can make things really bad with the same. It's when you're making the visualizations, it's looking at what's the right visual to use for the right context. And, sometimes you'll see people using trend lines when it should be a bar, or, there's lots of different ways that people do it. The use of pie charts. I don't know. Education seems to love a pie chart. I don't know why, but they really do. And they'll put, 17 different categories in there and you go, tell me what's going on in here. There's a lot of small slices. But it's making the right visual, the use of color on the visual, the fact that you shouldn't put too much on there. Don't layer 19 different things on the same visual and sort of make it. I've seen some wonderful examples of things that really don't help, but it's being clear. It's like, I also white space is your friend in this. It's keep things clear and highlight the things that you're talking about. If you're talking about progress, highlight the progress line of the group that you're looking at. If you're focusing on your lower ability students against others, highlight that element up and dull everything else. So actually that's the bit that shows. And it might show, oh, here's a challenge or here's not a challenge, depending on what it is. But whatever question you're trying to answer, hone in on that, and sort of that clarity is pretty good. But you need something that sparks an action from it. And that action might be, actually, everything's working, we need to carry on what we're doing. But it might be, oh, things aren't working. The trend is going down. We're struggling below where we should be. Our value add isn't as good as it should be, whatever it might be. But it's highlighting that bit you're looking at. And then you might have 5 or 6 different visuals that are looking at a different thing, and that's fine. But don't try and load everything into one area. So we use Power BI as our main tool to put things out, and that's running from our sort of Microsoft Fabric. So we're a bit more advanced in what we're doing in there. But the same thing is, that dashboard page should be, what is the most important thing? That's at the top left. That's the first thing you're going to view as you read that dashboard. And then you're going to flow through to a little bit more of the detail and context as you need to. But we try not to put too much on the page, because that will lose the impact of it. And it's trying to highlight what we need to highlight, to go, well, actually, most things we don't need labels on everything. We don't need, it's trying to keep it clean and clear and crisp. But you can do that in Google Sheets. You can do that in Excel. And there are some wonderful courses out there for the people that are making visualizations to get an idea of how best to do it. Years ago, when I worked at Ofsted, we put together a set of, if you're looking at these type of data, these are the visuals you should use to do it and how you should structure them. And I think when everything is done in that context, and again, it comes back to that little bit of control from one person setting the standards to say, this is the font you should try and use in different places. These are the titles and how they should look. And once people get that consistency, the more they see that in different areas, they're not trying to understand that's what's going on. They're drawn straight to the point. And I think when you see things that, okay, that looks similar to the things I look at every other week, or, what English is doing is similar to maths, what elementary, middle and high school do is similar. And you show people those visuals, if they look similar, they have the same construct and structure, and they're highlighting points, it's much easier for whoever it is reading that to have the takeaway straight away, rather than them trying to understand, okay, I need to read the x-axis, the y-axis, what's going on in the title, oh, there's numbers everywhere. And then they get confused, they've lost the message. So there's some thought process that goes into getting to that point. But again, as we talked about, somebody needs to set that process in place from the centre.
If you're a school leader, your day probably starts with questions. Who needs support? Where are the risks? What needs my attention right now? IntelliSchool helps answer those questions in real time by bringing attendance, well-being, behaviour and learning into one connected platform. IntelliSchool cuts through the noise and gives leadership teams the clarity they need. Fewer spreadsheets, smarter decisions, and more time to focus on what really matters, your students. Lead with confidence using IntelliSchool.
One of the things, Matthew, you were just talking about was the idea of flexibility, and you're talking, how about sort of that consistency piece as well, right? And I imagine that a good visualization would have a combination of flexibility and, for a lot of dashboards, you're thinking of like filters and all of the controls and things like that. We've seen data visuals evolve from static PDFs to more dynamic dashboards and things. And now we're seeing sort of another evolution of that with AI, and actually generating the visual sort of on the fly. But I worry a little bit about that consistency and flexibility balance as well. If the more flexible we get, do we lose some of the quality control or the consistency? How do we make sure that if someone is making a poorly worded data question, that they're not being served up with something that is quite misleading, while at the same time being able to be flexible enough to share with people the data that they really need?
I mean, I can offer a kind of a general idea around this, and I'm sure Howell can offer something a little more specific here. So in general, when we think about like just data use in research and data use in school governance and practice, it really is a question of like, is it valid? Validity is the ultimate measure of a data or study, and validity is based on how much you're generalizing from those results. And that really, I think, is a cultural foundation that's important to think about. Like when we use a technology in the classroom, we've learned over the years it's not the technology, it's our intent of how we use it and how we apply it. The same is true here, in that when we want to use data to tell a story for a formative practice It could be a little different threshold, like which teachers would benefit from this professional learning experience. I'm going to go in and look at how they've been managing the LMS to see who's logging in, to see if maybe our science teachers need a little different support than our social studies teachers in the system. That level of being sure and having a high degree of validity is a lower threshold than, say, making a decision about a student and what course of study you're going to recommend for them. Or should this teacher have a contract renewed based on their indicators of success over a period of time? And so I think bringing the literacy and bringing a culture that can understand that not all data is created equally and that we're going to use this like a tool, and making that a foundation to your school culture, to Howell's point, not our data culture, is going to be the long-term goal or strategy for successful schools. Because it's not going to be that same threshold for all decisions and how we use a dashboard or how we use any specific tool. It's going to be contextual to that environment. And in science, that we struggle with that, but in social science, that's what we breathe, because it's not always just, did the share price go up or down? Did that cell, grow by 4 grams or not? Our measures are a little more challenging sometimes. And so we have to bring in a layer of subtlety and understanding when we use any data for any kind of decision. And dashboards are magnifying the ability to do that. So as you talk about the next generation and just being able to put into an engine, search our school data to give me evidence or to tell me, is our spelling program more effective for this group of kids or this group of kids, or our reading program or our math or literacy program, we have to be really careful that we're not making decisions based on just that data alone. And I think from that is just this ground up literacy opportunity. Because again, most of us were not trained with how to use these kinds of tools and skills. And I'll end with the story of, the metaphor of, the guy who worked in the butcher shop for many years who's now a vegetarian. And sometimes, the more we learn about what goes into these systems and models and the greater literacy we have, the more careful we are about using them for rash decisions in isolation. And I think that's going to be the best long-term strategy for practitioners and leaders in the community, because the technology is going to be changing very rapidly. And I'm excited to hear how Howell is actually practically making sense of this with educators and parents and schools all around the world.
I think I go back to what you said there about the balance element of this. And you want people to be inquisitive. You want them to sort of play with the data, but you also have to have that balance to say, what should they be playing with and what shouldn't they be playing with? And I think, as we go a little bit more along the sort of AI route and asking questions of the data, you go back to the foundations. If your foundations aren't robust, you're going to get some terrible answers. It's going to tell you things you don't know. So the first thing I think what we try and do is the dashboards that we have and the visualizations and those bits, they are sort of structured in a way you can play with them, you can interact with them, you can filter them, but they're in a locked format in that sense. You could then ask questions of them and you'll get slightly different answers depending on how you ask that question. So there's a training element on how do you ask the right questions. But in able to do that properly, sort of thing with the future, you need your metadata against those things, because the prompt you will put in needs to be understanding what the data set is and what each data field is called, and all the different elements it can be. And if you said in an American school, you'd say grade, and that's the grade that the student's in. Grade in a British school wouldn't be the year, because that's the year, so you can have different bits. If you said academic year, what would that be? Is that the students, is that the current year, 25, 26, or is that the grade that they're in? There's lots of different ways you can do it, and as long as the metadata's fixed in the background now, you've made your data AI ready, you can start to do those things. But you're not going to start to do those things until you have your foundations in a really robust place. And a lot of the questions that people will want to ask can be done through a few clicks of a dashboard. You don't want people clicking 7, 8, 9 times. You want them to be able to have a couple of clicks. So you've got the right filters in place. That will help do most things. And then you can start looking at the next level. You don't want people to get scared of the dashboard So they just straight away go, I'm just going to ask a question I'm just going to do a prompt because I don't know what this set tells me. You want them to have a little look at it and then maybe delve in a little bit more. Or you want it to surface things for people to go, okay, maybe we can just put the highlights in here and the trend information that's going and surface that to people because that's probably what they want. And you'll have some people that are far more inquisitive and do want to play with it. And sometimes you want them to take the data off and they'll take that data and have a look at it in Excel and do some other things with it because they've got an idea. So you have to sort of try and cater for different types of people. And I think when you go to a school, there are very, very different types of people in that. You'll have your curriculum leaders, your middle leaders, you'll have your music teacher, your arts teacher can be quite different to your physics teacher, your maths teacher, your English teacher. They'll all have a slightly different way of looking at data. Some of them it's part of their roles. This is what they do in their job, so they have that passion for getting involved in it and looking. Other people go, I've never liked data in my life, that's why I teach this. So I don't want to do that. So you have to try and cater for everyone. It's not overly possible to do it all the time, but it's trying to make sure that you do have that person who doesn't like data, doesn't really want to play with Excel. They can also find the insights they need through a data product or a dashboard or a tool or a report, whatever that might be. That you're giving them something they can take away and go, oh no, I understand my class, I understand my year group, I understand my subject better just by looking at this thing. And then they can go off and potentially talk to someone in their school or someone else that has a better idea and maybe go, but I'd really like to delve into it this way. Is that possible? I don't know how to do it myself, but how can you support me? So I think it's sort of that challenge of, people are very, very different in schools across the board. And if a school can find those people that are really keen and really good at the data bit, it's using them to be that sort of the champions and the people that can help the others to sort of fall in love with data a little bit. I had one ex-colleague of mine who hated data. She actually said to me, you made me love data because you've made it simple. And a part of it is, if I make it complex, you're not going to engage in it. I need to make it simple so you can look at it and go, okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yep, okay, I get you now. Some of the times it just reiterates what they already know, and that's good because they go, brilliant, that's what I thought. I've now seen the numbers behind it, and I'm more confident we're doing the right thing. Sometimes I'll throw a spanner in the works and go, okay, yeah, that's not what I was thinking. Why might that be? And then you have that further conversation to go, well, let's delve into it. And I know that they're probably not going to do it themselves because it's not their skill set, it's not their direction. But if they've got someone that they can go to and say, look, I'd like to delve into this because I think there's something in it, you can have a play around and have a look at it. And as Damian said, a wonderful scatter plot will show up really good things for people.
I wonder, before we move to the final question, I wonder if I can just return to insights. And I know there's an irony in this because you said that often only a small amount of time is left to talk about insights. And here I am talking about insights when we've only got a small amount of time left on the podcast episode. But I know our listeners are going to be keen to hear specific examples. And I just wonder if each of you can just think of maybe just one example of when you've seen a data insight actually lead to a significant or positive shift or change in policy, practice, or mindset.
The other year when I was consulting, I worked with a school and we were sort of delving into IB information. And it was looking at sort of some benchmarking stuff, but getting right into the subjects and the component parts that make up the diploma bits. And we noticed something interesting on the practical element of science. They weren't hitting 6s and 7s on the practical element, and that was something they should be because they're doing pretty well, and that was holding them back a little bit. And sort of that's something I'd highlighted, and we'd looked at it and said, other schools like you would be getting quite a few of these results high performing. And it turns out that a while ago, a decision was made to reduce the lab size. So they reduced the lab size in the school because they used part of it for doing something else. And therefore, the lab time had gone down in the school. And a couple of years later, that had resulted in the practical elements of their science diploma scores coming down. And so, our kids aren't spending as much time in labs doing practical work, and therefore they haven't got the results to do. And that actually led to the school speaking to the board that they had to reinvest in expanding the labs. So it's sort of something that you can go, quite a little tangible thing that was just playing around with the data and saying, well, that's interesting across the 3 subjects. They used to be really good and they sort of dipped off and we're not getting those top level results anymore. Why might that be? And then the context comes. And that's, I always go back to the context is key within education to go, oh yeah, we made a decision a couple of years ago to remove that bit. Okay, so smaller labs, less time in them. A couple of years later, the results have gone down on it. Okay, to push our results back up, we probably need to either spend more time in the lab or have more labs. And that was something that came out a couple of years ago. It was something that was only a little find, but it's actually resulted in a decision made a couple of years ago has had a negative impact, and now we need to reverse that.
That's fascinating. What about you, Damian?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go with something that's really, kind of on the other side to just illustrate the breadth of how data gets used. And this is a story from a school coming out of the pandemic that had a whole new, like the library had kind of been reinvented through the pandemic and in the school building when it was closed and then reopened. And the librarian had collected data for forever on just usage stats, what books were being taken out by which kids. And it basically just sat in a file of just like student name, book, was it overdue or not? And by just taking that data and combining it with kind of just the demographic information the school had on just the gender of the kid, their age, their reading information, their reading ability, we were able to make such a rich connection between the library staff, the curricular leaders, and the reading teachers and the literacy folks. So during the summer, the librarian compiled that information, just the most basic information, and shared it back with the reading teachers and the teachers, and then with parents. And then they started looking, well, how is this changing? And for which kids is it changing in which ways? And how can we change our resources in the classroom based on this information? So simple information that every school has collected for the last 100 years, just taking that information and putting it into a context in a situation where you can use it and look at those patterns and trends and inform simple things. So that's data that's like already existing in the system. A simpler example would be like in Michigan, we asked kids, and this was inspired by international schoolwork at American School of Bombay and Sujoy Choudhury, where we simply asked fourth graders, like, what did you have for breakfast? And do you feel ready for learn? Every day on their iPad during morning meeting for months. Took 20 seconds. We sort of stashed that data aside, combined it with some demographic information. And that simple information from those fourth graders collected over maybe 6 months was able to be used by the government in the city to usher in an entire breakfast program and a school nutrition program. I mean, like 20 seconds a day, little kids on their iPads filling out a survey, just saying, like, what did I have for breakfast? And it turned out when we visualized it, the most common breakfast was nothing for these kids for a whole lot of reasons. And we looked at which kids, and it got even more dire. Just bringing that to the surface and letting our decision makers and policymakers plug that into their programs and cultures is a great first step.
I think that's really interesting because, we said earlier on that those data sets were probably sitting in a silo somewhere without a student ID to understand who those students are to match up to the demographics. And it's sort of like, oh, yeah, we put that's sitting there, the library, who's taking what books out, but it's on a name rather than an ID. So no one's ever tried to go, well, let's bring it all together and match it up. I think that's a really, really good one. I think that would be something that a lot of schools could do. I doubt schools have got a data catalog of going, what do we collect? Where is it? Who owns it? But there's probably some really good longitudinal data sets sitting in silos on someone's laptop somewhere.
I love it. 100%.
Thank you both for a wonderful conversation. We're going to sort of round this out with sort of one capstone question, I guess. If you could give one piece of advice to a school that's starting its data journey, what might that be? What would be one thing that a school could do to get started? Howell, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think start simple. Look at your key things you need to collect. What are for that, whatever your school is or school group is, look at those key data sets and collect them well, and put someone in charge of owning that. Have someone who's accountable for making sure that is collected and pulled together. And that's the start of your foundations. It might be 3 or 4 data sets. It might be a little bit on demographics. It might be some progress in your table. Not much, but once you have that as your base, you can start to build on that as well. So yeah, start simple and don't overcomplicate things.
Yeah, I would echo that entirely. And again, just think of opportunities that are already in the system. What are you already sitting on? What can you use that for? And if you can pair it with action research for teachers, it can be very, very powerful, because then all of a sudden there's an initiative and it's driven from the bottom up based on teacher needs and what they care about. So coming up with a structure, data for data's sake might matter for us, but for a classroom teacher, I loved your example of a math teacher, a music teacher that's been tasked with making use of data, or a math teacher being tasked to manage data for their school. These are really common scenarios and hats people wear. So how can we, just support them at the most base level and give them, that ground to stand on?
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, genuinely. Loads of nuggets here for everybody. I'm so grateful to both of you, Damian and Howell, for spending this precious time with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Tune in next time as we continue our data conversations with educators and thought leaders from around the world.